Sabin ko ikirjibonte Johar, Chilke Minabue. I am Ashish Biruli and I am one of the founding members of Adivasi Lives Matter. You might have not understood what I said at the beginning. I greeted you all in my 4000 years old Ho indigenous language. So in India right now there are around 700 rich languages spoken by almost 500 diverse indigenous communities. Indigenous communities don't have a written record of their history and knowledge. It is the language that they rely upon because it carries generations of history and knowledge through custom songs and folk stories. Have you ever imagined what happens if a language dies or a community dies? The rich knowledge of 1000 years also die along with them. There are articles written on indigenous communities and they are mostly written by non-indigenous people and has lots of misrepresentation and misinformation which leads to lots of misunderstanding about the community. For instance, from the perspective of non-indigenous people, the indigenous community which live in forest are considered as the destroyer of the forest and a threat to the tigers or any other wild animals. But the truth is, it is the indigenous community who has been protecting the forest and the wild animals. This is a very prime reason why indigenous people should be telling their own stories with their own perspective, and the world needs to cooperate and understand.
Johar everyone, this is Ankush. Along with Ashish and Isha, I co-founded Adivasi Lives Matter, which is quickly turning into India's main destination for stories by Adivasi youth. Traditionally, if we have seen, it is always the people in power who have written books or documented histories. Even the history that we study in our schools or academic institutions has always been written by those communities, those races or those castes which have held power. These communities have always had access to education, to the written and spoken word, and also access to publishing houses. Therefore, a lot of history about indigenous communities is almost never recorded. That happens at the local, regional, state level, but that also happens at a central level, where one part of the country does not know about the rich history of indigenous communities in the other parts of the country. Through Adivasi Lives Matter and our flagship project Adivasi Awaz, which translates as Voice of the Indigenous Youth, this is what we set out to do. We asked simple questions that who should be telling the stories about India's indigenous communities? Should it be the reporters, journalists, and media persons who go from a city with little or no contextual understanding and maybe visit once or twice in a year? Or would it be better to enable the indigenous youth themselves to tell these stories in the languages that they speak about the communities in which they live? This was the premise with which we started Adivasi Awaz. And this has completely blown our minds over the last couple of years. We have been humbled, we have been super grateful that this has now turned into a platform where elders are passing on their knowledge, their information, their wisdom to younger indigenous youth who are equipped with smartphones and knowledge of digital tech.
Under the flagship project, 125 indigenous youth from the states of Tamil Nadu, Chhattisgarh and Tripura have been trained on how to tell their community stories digitally through their smartphones. They make videos and write articles on rich culture of their community, about their language, and also about the challenges the community faces. The best thing about this project is the indigenous youth can proudly make videos in their own mother language. Till now, they have created around more than 300 original stories and they have been paid 1 million Indian rupees by this project. This initiative is helping them archive their rich culture, tradition, custom, which in a way is the language and culture revitalization.
This is what we have learned through Adivasi Awaz and Adivasi Lives Matter. that the stories of indigenous communities must be recorded by the indigenous people themselves. As allies, there is a lot that non-indigenous communities can do, is to create an enabling space for knowledge exchange, is to create a space where non-judgmental conversations can take place. And this is why we feel that the smartphone is such a beautiful tool. It is not that expensive. Internet is relatively cheap in India as well as in many parts of the world. And since there is a barrier of the written word, which a lot of indigenous people in India still cannot read, especially the elders, we think that the spoken word is a great tool. Indigenous communities have always been incredible oral storytellers. That's how the stories and the histories have been passed down from generation to generation. And we think this is why indigenous people of the world should be taking their mobile phones to tell their own stories. The history should be written and recorded by indigenous peoples themselves in the languages that the communities speak. We need to understand that among the 7,000 languages that exist in the world today, most of them are spoken by indigenous peoples, which are very small in number. Almost all of the languages spoken by indigenous people in India are in some level of endangerment. How will this stop? If we record, preserve, promote, and revitalize these languages by recording day-to-day life, by documenting the cultural wisdom, by documenting the agricultural knowledge, by documenting knowledge about biodiversity conservation or plant-based medicine or mud architecture. So many things. There's so much that all of us owe to the indigenous communities for preserving and carrying on for generations together. And it is high time that all of us put our voices together along with the voice of the indigenous people. Not speak for them, but create spaces where indigenous communities can speak for themselves. Thank you so much. This is Ankush from Adivasi Lives Matter. Johar.